Okay, question over there.
At Tallinn University, we're going through similar reforms, and when I ask what's broken that you're fixing, the argument that's normally explained to me is that it's an economic argument. That is that the model in which Tallinn University organizes itself is not economically sustainable, it's going to go bankrupt. When I was a student at Manchester in the mid-2000s, they were also going through a reform. And I remember asking my professors the same question: what is broken that you're fixing with this? And it, again, was saying Manchester University was going bankrupt, and so it's always an economic argument. However, the kind of reforms that are being implemented, I'll leave Ian to talk about Manchester, whether that worked or not. But the kind of reforms that I'm observing at Tallinn University and that I gathered by Eva, I don't see how is it that they're producing surplus value. I don't see how it's producing more money. See, if we need to make these changes in order to make more money, then I don't see this. What's at stake here rather feels to me is a changing in a reform in the way in which academic work is valued or assessed. I don't see how these reforms translate to higher revenues for the university. And maybe it's because the university is not meant to be economically sustainable. Maybe it's because the university is not meant to produce a profit. So to talk about the university as something that is meant to produce money, it's similar to asking the police department to also produce money, to make hospitals to produce money, and to make them economically sustainable. So I wonder if you could, where's my question? I wrote it down, sorry. So yeah, it seems to me that the university is never profitable because it does not generate surplus value. So these schemes are not about raising tuition fees. They're not about encouraging staff to subsidize their salaries or to pay their own salary by writing grants. It's basically it's more about changing the standards by which academic value is measured. It's about encouraging staff and students to comply with international organizations that assess performance. However, those reforms are being done under an economic argument, and I don't see how that squares up. I don't see how I mean, one thing is to change the way in which we assess our work. Another thing is to raise economic value. So I wonder if you could share your thoughts on this confusion that I have. If I made sense, I'm sorry to jump around. To the three of you, because it's a common comment when I go out for drinks with friends and we're talking about our jobs and our job securities, and this often comes up. And when I also talk with my managers, it also comes out. They always say, no, that Italian university is going bankrupt. We need to change because it's going to close down in 5 years. So we have to fire people because it's going bankrupt. We can't afford it. But then the reforms that is implemented, and hearing you talk, the reforms are not about raising revenue. They're about assessing, about publishing more. They're about getting more times higher education ratings. They're about publishing. I don't see how publishing more journals raises more money for the university. Or maybe you could explain that. How does that work?
My first reflection to you is what reforms? What are you talking about? Because I think
the reforms that
every three of us talked about different things, and you are drawing also on a different experience from the Tallinn. You talked about new public management and that it brought in the system, the performance evaluation. You talked about the part of the financing of higher education, and where the question is where to get money to finance higher education, and you also talked about the evaluation and the publications. I talked about, I think, something else altogether. Or sort of, I tried to talk about where we are going with our higher education and research, and how we frame it. So we three of us, we talked about slightly different, probably the same animal, the same elephant, the trunk or the
The
tail.
three of us spoke about
Right.
reforms. The three of you talked about changing
Right.
the university structure. And perhaps my question is, change it from what into what?
Right.
Change it from what into what? What is it that
Right.
what is your motivation to change the university structure? Perhaps that's another way.
Right, I could speak for myself,
Yeah.
and I would say that when I think about what we are actually doing, and in this whole broad thing, it's really hard to navigate, and also you have to find something to anchor yourself. So what I'm anchoring to myself is the understanding of institutions the way Eleanor Ostrom understands it. It is rules of the game. It is, you will do this, good things will follow, you will do that, bad things will follow, right? And if you get the rules of the game at any level straight, I think the system has to perform and flourish, right? This getting things right, getting the backbone straight instead of whatever, I think is the core of what we have to do. And how that translates from the abstract sort of speaking about it into a program, let's say grant proposal program that we are putting out. We ask that grant proposal program, that grant proposal to be evaluated by international panel of peers that don't have vested interests, are not personally involved with the grant, and that they look at the quality of the idea, they look at the impact of that idea, social and economic, and then they look at the composition of the team. So this is a core backbone and this sort of core institution of science, right? So, and in this way, we can think through every single step, every single program. And if we would go to evaluation at the individual level, then it is important what is the core and what is the backbone for that evaluation. Publication would be one thing, working with the students would be another thing, having research funds probably would be third thing, or something else, but that is to be defined by the institution itself.
Susan.
Could I trouble you to switch this thing back on for me? Sorry. I want to answer your question, hopefully, because it's a big question. And the bit I missed out in my talk was, what does it mean to make universities part of a global knowledge economy? And using Polanyi's ideas of formal economy and embedded economy, I think it's quite interesting to think of the way that the formal, like the disembedded, Polanyi's ideas are that the economy gets disembedded from social relationships. It then generates a logic of its own, which is then reimposed on the social relationships. And I think that's what's been happening to the university. That when I was young, that academic work involved all sorts of social relationships, all sorts of relationship with society and all sorts of things. And gradually there's just been the economic aspect of what we do has been prioritised. That's been then turned into a model, which is then reimposed on the university. And the other kind of relationships disappeared. Whereas if you take Polanyi's second idea of ecos, and the embedded economy, which is very close to anthropological ideas of economic, there being economic aspects as there are political aspects in also almost everything we do, in all kinds of social relations, religion, or whatever else, or in our case within the university, then the work of Anna Singh, the anthropologist who's just written the Mushroom at the End of the World, which I think is the best book I've ever read, she's looking at the way in which ecologies work, which is similar to Polanyi's idea of an embedded economy, as a whole set of interactions, and that fits with my Brown diagram, continuous interactions to try and create livable landscapes, she calls them. And some of those relationships work out wrong and are predatory or negative, and she says it's a miracle when you get synergies. And I think that's where I would like universities to go. I'm still puzzling with the question I was asked right by the lady behind you about what's the answer. I think to re-embed the economic aspects of the university's work within a wider range of social relationships. And one way of thinking what's been happening there is this cuckoo diagram. So how can I get that up? Yeah. So if you think of a university as made up of circuits of exchange, here I've put, this is work I've done with Rebecca Bowden, the usual kind of classical circuits of exchange, excludable goods, non-excludable goods, rivalrous and non-rivalrous. But then I've fitted a kind of Maussian type of exchange relationship to each of those things. So you can have private goods where there's direct exchange. You can have common goods where there's indirect exchange. You can have club goods where there's direct exchange, and there's public goods where there's indirect exchange. And a university's optimal circuits of exchange might look like that, where you've got an amount of work which is economic, and which is private goods for sale. But then that is feeding into the public goods and the common goods. So you use the research that you do commercially to fund the other activities of the university. But what we think has happened is that that's grown into a cuckoo's egg. Mm-hmm. And also the arrows have moved the other way. And this is where the Polanyi's economic model becomes the dominant model of what the university is about. Whether it's economic or not, in a sums kind of way, but ideologically it's economic. And what we argue is, for restoring the economy of the university, you need to restore a more balanced circuit of exchange.
I'm sorry, I have to put this on the table. There is a missing element here, and that's substantial, and that is value. It's a public value. You know, it is public value. So what do we value? And this is missing here. And this gives economic perspective, and this continuous economic perspective, it doesn't allow you to break out of economic perspective. If you want to really talk about the embeddedness and economy being embedded in the community, then the question is, how do you achieve that embeddedness? And I think one way how to think about it and how to sort of push that door or pull that door open is to put on the table what values we as a community, we as an economy, or we as a university or as a country, what we as people have. And then we sort of bring out this sort of element, and I think that's where the universities have crucial role, because nobody else will be sort of voicing, everybody is actually voicing values out, but in this sort of thought through and responsible way, I think it's a responsibility of every single scholar to voice out those values.
I'm sorry, but as a scholar, I don't feel the need for it. I'm voicing values sometimes just because I can't keep my mouth shut. I'm sorry, but I don't feel this encouragement and I don't. And that's not personal. I really want to say something general here. It's not that scholars always feel, or academics, that values they could try to somehow see, discern, and describe the values that are circulating. Values in general are very intangible. The value as such is a very tangible entity, right? So I'm not encouraged. I can't submit a proposal for postdoc research to research values. I cannot. I don't.
Why not?
Where do
Why
they
not?
fit? Where do they fit? Where do they fit in this smart specialization strategy? Could you please show us?
Actually, added value is contained even in the word, the value, right? And so what is added value, or what types of values, and what actually value is? I mean,
Yeah,
there is
that's
a
the thing.
question, there is a lot of questions to be
I'm
asked
interested in
about.
that. How does the state define value, or perhaps Latvia? How does that, and what is valuable?
Right. I will answer you just with one, and it's not state. I will speak for myself
Okay,
and the
sure.
work I'm doing as a public official and one who writes writes policies. I wrote that smart specialization with the team, and I was one. You can blame me for every single one. It's me, actually. You know, me, my fingers, right? And where do I see values? And I answered on your first question that backbone, which is straight. The basic rules of the game are straight. That's my core value. I've defined that value for myself, that is what I'm putting in the center of that work that I'm doing here for this particular time being, because what is broken, you asked the nurses, what is broken? The backbone is broken. The moment the backbone will be fixed, I think we will strive. While it is the way it is, we will not. And the reason why have been historical circumstances through which we've lived, and that defines who we are today as a society, and as also scholars, as university, as organizations, as institutions. So, and I think the core thing we have to do is fix our backbones, and that's my value.
I want to also allow other people to express. We have had several hands raised. Let's do by pairs. One first here, then Christina over there, and after that Francisco and sorry, forgot your name. Yes. Okay, so let's start with you two.
So I'm here representing the Student Union of Latvia, which has been discussed a lot here. So first of all, just a small comment on the discussion that was before. I think that there's a small misconception as to two words that sound the same, homonyms, but are different, which is value as the economic term, and values, which are the cultural terms. And I think in this discussion, you got them mixed up, so just to divide it. But the real question here is regarding value, is there has been a large discussion which started in, I'm guessing, 2003 with the Minister of Education Tielis, of education of a private or a public good. And that's the real discourse here, the real question which has not been resolved. For example, if we define as education as a private good, then we move to the model of personally funded higher education through loans. However, if we define it as a public good, as providing public value, then we move to a model of course, state-funded higher education. So the question is here to the colleague who has researched Denmark, which has publicly funded the higher education. Since we are quickly approaching the crossroads in Latvia, I believe that when we will have to decide what was Denmark's experience with it, and maybe if someone from Estonia would also be very happy to hear your remarks on it.
Yeah, I also had problems with this high added value of the paper because only some remarks. I'm from Lithuania, and it was very interesting for me to listen to the representative of Latvian Ministry of Education, because I hear many parallels with the arguments, with the rhetoric and framing, and all these like saying that we have to be innovative, that we're territory of Europe, so we have to move in front of everything and so on. So one of the comments is that higher added value is value loaded itself, what already other commenters said, because who defines what is the value? And the discussion moved further now, but for example, even if you say that higher added value is measured by number of publications, number of students, and so on. In reality, it doesn't always lead to increase of quality of education, increase of quality of knowledge, and so on. I work at the university, and when I compare, for example, situation, I don't know, when I was studying, which was early Lithuanians, and now, I can say that the now universities, at least in Lithuania, just to have students to produce, so that the students finish the programs. Some of students who finish now would have never ever entered university 10 years ago. So how do you measure this value? Sometimes with my colleagues who are talking that, okay, we have to publish many publications in these higher level journals, but sometimes we joke that in reality, how much impact it gives to our everyday life, what it changes, and we have this term noise. We make much noise, which is measured them in numbers, but then so what? So my point is that if it's often referred to the rules of game, like we also have the anthropologist Baker and others who wrote about rules of the game, but in this game you always have teams, leaders, and prizes and rules, and there should be agreement about the rules, prizes, and so on, and not only top-down rules put on. So my question would be how much discussion is between different players in this game, different teams, in discussing what is this higher added value, one, and how do you measure? Is it added value, or is it just noise, quantity, but no value?
Thank you.
How many times have you discussed with your team or with other people? How many times you did it? How many times you gave answers to this question? You yourself.
I mean,
Yes, you yourself as a scholar. How many times you define what is
there are
value?
discussions almost every day, because as a scholar I can see you very ethnographic. Also, since I'm an anthropologist, very ethnographic. When I completed my studies in Scandinavia as a PhD student, I saw much value here. And it was not measured, I don't know, in publications, even if you were very high level professor here, but you just enter university and you could feel quality everywhere. I mean, discussions and so on, and nobody cared so much about which journal and which I don't know you will publish your. I mean, it was not the most important measure. And when after my studies I returned back to Lithuania, I was right in the midst of these reforms, and my own feelings were just that somehow I felt as I'm in the army, and all these publications are like, in the like in the army, you have different levels and so on. But now I used to it. I started to play in accordance to the rules. I look why I publish. I do not publish in the journal which is maybe more interesting for youth in Lithuania, would be more read, but I cannot use my time for this. I will publish somewhere where only my mother and me will read it, and so on. So my question is, okay, I am playing with this, but does it really add, for me quality is bad, and does it really add this quality? Because some people around I see they can play very easily in this new system, but does it produce really new knowledge? Only the number of articles which is all about the same, only different titles. Just one example, I am not sure.
See, that's broken backbone.
Okay.
Sorry, it's your broken backbone.
One more
Oh,
example.
sorry,
Let's say
broken
that
backbone. Producing this, taking the same article and publishing in several places. That's your broken backbone. That it is wrong because you want to produce one good paper. And if your department asks you to produce whatever and facilitates, it's another very broken backbone. And in this way, sort of, we can sum it up. And I think our joint, everybody's responsibility is to sort of find those ways and actually sort of to talk about those things. And that's why I think we are here and talking about those things. And to define those values, you know.
Just small comment, like when you have scheme, like as they said, like structural functionalism, like how the system works. When you go into the everyday life, it never works as in the scheme, never ever. And just one example, I hope I'm correct, I read it somewhere, and I'm not sure if the source is correct, but Weber, Max Weber, I think I read, I might be wrong, that he was allowed by university not to write anything for, I think, 3-4 years. And then after this, he produced the work which still has impact until today. But if he's working today, he would be pushed from university in 2 years as a complete loser. Yeah. Maybe I'm working for such a business.
Yeah, there's a lot in these two questions. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. Arkadis. I thought your point about the difference between values in economic terms and values was absolutely spot on. And I think what I'm trying to do here is really not use the word value because it has that duality and it's so confusing. Rather to look at relationships and what comes out of those relationships. So in a sense, this is a diagram of values, and it's of different kinds of values. Now, I suppose the strategy is very much in the Brown blog, and of course it's very sensible for the university to have a strategy for innovation and to be part of a national strategy of innovation. Absolutely nothing against that. But the question, I mean, the way it was discussed in Denmark was, should all knowledge or all university be for all industry? Because when you put up your diagram, it was clear that there were 4 or 5 disciplines that were really the focus disciplines of your strategy. And that's the same. There's the same disciplines and the same industries in Denmark for their strategy. And it might be very sensible for those industries to have that kind of strategy. And it might, I hope it would, enhance the competitiveness of the country and enhance the economy of the country. But the question is whether that system is needed for all the other industries and all the other disciplines which are not part of that focal area. And I think that's really the big question. In Denmark, there was a big argument because the industrial interests, specific industrial interests, wanted all the university's resources turned in their direction, and they won the argument. So the all university became focused on those interests. Whereas I think if you take this kind of approach, you can see that different disciplines might be contributing to different of these blocks, and they might have different kinds of value overall. So that was one point that I wanted to make coming out of your very good thing there. You asked about the experience in Denmark. The students have successfully fought, and the current fight is that we have a 5-year funding, and the government wants to cut off the last 2 years and make that into a loan. And that's the current fight, to try and keep the whole 5 years as public funding. But your compatriots in Denmark are fighting valiantly to try and keep that safe. And why is it important? Well, I think, okay, it's important within the European debates, but if you look worldwide, the World Bank has changed its strategy. The World Bank has now sent a delegation to Chile, which was the poster child of the Chicago Boys, and introduced the highest university fees and the most privatized higher education sector in the world. The World Bank has now sent a delegation there to help the Chileans. Now we don't even have a word for it. republicise, deprivatise, what do we call it? To turn their system back into a public system. So in a way, Europe is a little bit behind the game here. The debates about the global knowledge economy that are going on around the world, it isn't a long-term strategy. It's going to start fizzling fairly soon. So all these things are moving very, very fast. And I think the strength of a university is to keep this diversity so that it can survive whatever the big story, the grand narrative changes. And the last point I'd like to make is coming from your point about when you have a system of incentives that says your department will get rewarded if you salami slice your work and produce 4 or 5 articles where you could have produced 1. There's a huge dilemma there, because to be a good citizen of the department, you should maximise the income of the department. But as a good academic, you maybe know that that isn't the best way to use your material. And there's what I call a greedy system working here, that the incentives are set up according to a new set of values, if you like, but yet the powers that be are referring to an old set of values that they want to survive despite the new incentives. So for example, in Denmark, we have this system where we're paid for each student who passes an exam. And of course the incentive there is to lower the pass rates. Well, we have stood out against that, but now it's becoming more and more of a pressure to do that. But this has been going on for 20 years, and the ministry has always answered the question, isn't this an incentive for lowering values? To say, no, we can rely on the academic professionalism. Well, the professionalism comes from a different regime. Mm-hmm. And there's a new regime, and it's trying to push us in a different direction. And it's greedy if it wants us to be 2 things at once.
Francisco.
Yeah, I want to follow on Carlos' comment with 2 specific questions. The first one anthropological, the second one political. The anthropological question goes to Dr. Lovisco. You were before researching on in Chechnya, which means that the fieldwork, so to say, was far away. So I would like to hear some nuances of related to this change of the fact that you are researching nowadays about your home country and about the institutions in which you are involved, which are affecting you. The second question to Dr. Kiopa is about these strategies he's been describing, the policy according to which education is to serve the needs of the national economy. Which are the negative side effects that you have prevent or you have listed beforehand? For instance, as we notice nowadays, there is a different notion of relevance. You are representing the state normativity or criteria of relevance, because academics have a different criteria. And also I wanted to share a comment at the end, which is related with my impressions after 5 years here in the Baltics. I got the impression that anthropology is not simply peripheral, it's double peripheral, in the sense that it's peripheral within the global knowledge production, but it's also peripheral within the current society or institutional building or state, so to say. And that can be transformed into an invitation of the organizers of the Baltic Anthropology Graduate School to rethink the what for of graduating more people and producing more doctoral students in a context of state withdrawal, when there are no postdocs or tenure track positions secured, or in a context in which officials are talking or relating anthropological knowledge with success, being industrially employed, entrepreneurial discovery, and so on and so on. Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much for your information. I was also thinking a little bit about the young Einstein, whether he would be able to succeed within an application process in this framework of smart specialization, whether we would identify relativity theory in this area with haptic value, which leads me to the question, is it not a paradox to, because your question, the sentence described me, what matters is to work for the aim we go for. Is it not a paradox to know where the innovation lies, so to identify in advance in an innovative field? Is it or innovation or disruption? I mean, as an example, the most disruptive company at the moment disrupted a very conservative sector, taxi. So is it not a contradiction? And what I maybe missed, or maybe is in your slides, do you differentiate between fundamental research, applied research, third-party research, which makes, I think, a huge difference in evaluating those different levels?
Probably the political question first.
Political was to you. Eva was the anthropological one about the nuances of doing fieldwork at home and within local institutions.
No, I think because the other two kind of go together, probably, right? I think probably Eva goes first about the fieldwork.
Quickly. It's actually I'm not the institutions is not my focus per se. This was actually an attempt to provide a comment from my own and other colleagues' experience under the current regime, I would say, of science, technology, and innovation. So that's not my primary focus. But what is common between these two is that actually, as anthropologists, we concentrate on what seems to matter for us as a society, and we try to analyze as best as we can in these particular social contexts. So, to return to values or goods, public goods, actually, this dialogue was present in Chechnya, of course, in a totally different environment, under totally different circumstances, as it is present in Latvia, from a different angle. And the unifying link is that it is important not only to me personally, but perhaps to a wider, I'm actually convinced, to a wider society, wider social circles. That's why it is, that's why it should be researched, in my opinion.
I'll start with Einstein. Einstein wouldn't bother. He wouldn't give a damn about writing a proposal for smart specialization. And the reason why I'm saying I read quite a bit about Einstein for my dissertation because one thing that I was searching for, how friends helped him, right? So in the way how friends helped him, when he was unemployed, they secured employment for him by asking, one friend of his asked his father to hire him as a patent officer, and that's where he spent quite a few years after he got out of the school, or was kicked out of the school, or whatever, because nobody liked him because he was talking back to all his professors, so he was not a comfortable student. Right? So for anybody, so he was out there, he was outlier, he was Einstein, right? So and then when already sort of it all picked up, and then he became sort of a star that was part of the establishment, right? So that much about the Einstein, right?
But sorry to interrupt. That means you're
It doesn't
expecting
mean,
Nobel
it
Prize
doesn't.
winners in Latvia. They are outside your system.
That doesn't mean anything. I said he's outlier. It doesn't mean anything. I think it means that there are all kinds of people, all kinds of players, and that all is there in a system, and everybody has a role, and in that ecosystem, in that whole evolution. To me, I look at the things a little bit more from the evolutionary perspective, and then let me see. This relevance. Oh gosh, I can't read it.
Negative side effects.
Right, negative relevance, negative side effects, and what we prevented. Right. I talk about the relevance deliberately, and that goes a little bit with the side effects and a little bit together with what colleagues said from Lithuania, and it also goes to what you saw in places you worked and what you spoke about Denmark. Yeah, there is a globalization. Everybody talks the same things. Yes, European Commission trying to understand what to do with Europe, how to sort of reorganize that. Looked at the U.S., decided, wow, there's sort of something is going on there. There's Silicon Valley. There's Valley. You can see how there is a specialization. We have to come up with a smart specialization. Voila, there is smart specialization. In our case, we are periphery, receiving substantial cohesion money because we are periphery. So for us, as policymakers, we have no choice, but we have to frame our policies according to those rules that we are given. So, and I found that challenge for myself a very interesting intellectual challenge, and that goes to your question, what you prevented. We actually did prevent quite a few things. The way how we defined directions, priorities, specialization areas, we were not asked to define that way. We were asked to name three specialization areas for Latvia, in which Latvia now will specialize, and in which we will invest everything. So, name, let's say, nanotechnologies, name, let's say, wooden buildings, name, let's say, embedded technologies. Voila, specialized. No, I think it's wrong. I think what we are talking here about is actually smart diversification, and that's how we built our strategy. We picked our industrial strategy, we built the whole sort of way of thinking around it, and we argued hard with European Commission for, I would say, some 8 or 9 months to actually get our opinion through, get ourselves heard, buy them in to our way of thinking about it, and buying them in, legitimize what we are doing here, and also it also helped us to sort of withstand the vested interests which were bombarding us from inside. So, and to go and name very particular things that we sort of prevented was that one thing is the specialization in our case is actually diversification. And what else was there? That whole thing about the relevance. One thing what is sort of your normal public official would know. Usually, people in ministries do not have PhDs. My department has. We are hiring PhDs. So anybody who is looking for a job, come join us, right? And we have 2 positions open, looking more at the students right here. Your normal public official usually reads public officials' documents. They read commission documents, they read policies, and they often plagiarize those policies. And then when you research us, you say that there is sort of it disseminates the ideas flow. We actually plagiarize in many cases, right? And that's what we learn at school. We learn to plagiarize, right? Sorry, I couldn't.
Sounds like a bit of backbone.
Everywhere. No, in society, everywhere. We are post-Soviet society. Face it. Yes, and there's a lot of work to do. We are 20 years now practicing democracy, and it's not that easy. But then you also, sorry, I'll shut up in a moment. You asked about the paradox and fundamental research and applied research. Yes, there is a paradox, and I think it's productive. Because there are many things, there are many doors, there are many openings, and if you are creative, I think you can find your place. If you cannot, and if you are hardcore anthropologist, hardcore philosopher, hardcore historian who does the fundamental research, believes in his thing, and will die for this thing, it's great. And we do distinguish between fundamental and applied research for some reasons, several reasons. First, because everybody knows those two terms, right? And in our law on scientific activity, they are already fixed. We have fundamental research, we have applied research, we have research that is market-oriented. So we already have ready-made terms we can work around. So we do have a program for fundamental research, which is very small. I think it reduces to zero. It's 4 million euros a year at the moment. For all whole country, it's zero, right? It's zero. I find my personal challenge how to make it 8 million in next coming years, like 2 years, and how to make it, let's say, with that 1 0 in 80 million in, let's say, 5-year frame. That's probably that 5 years a little too ambitious, but that is doable. But I think
for all disciplines also.
Yes, it's welcome to our reality, sort of. You know so all smart specialization framing that comes along with cohesion money that we have a chance to invest and actually get ourselves up. And therefore, this is all about getting ourselves up, and that inevitably, sort of, for us, it's sort of that's our bread and butter, what we live at the moment. But then, as for this fundamental research, the way how I think about it, and the way I'm also trying to explain everybody around me and politicians and to everybody when I have a chance, I'm saying that fundamental research has to be done so that students have a chance to work with those scholars and have a chance to learn to think outside of the box. When they go out after that experience, that they had the chance to be around that person, they go and they can do whatever they want to, but they've learned something else, which is like this true, in my books, true value, right? They go with it, and I think everybody of us, I certainly have had a couple sort of interaction with those sort of very few people that are those like hardcore, the hardcore scholars. There's the flavor of everybody is sort of, the composition is different.
There were a couple of more questions, I think. Do you want to?
Just one question. I thought it was very honest of you just to show us your algorithm, not that I understood the algorithm, for the performance incentives. But I guess the question for you is, it's interesting to think that you felt, you said the strategy which clearly is what ministries should do. Did you think about any other way of incentivizing other than setting performance targets? Because I'm speaking about the UK, where the ministries don't give themselves that problem. They say, right, they devolve it to groups of other organisations. In some ways, what the problem here seems to me to be that it's the incentives, the targets you've created that's created the sense, not the strategy, not the vision. It's more the sort of the operation of it. And would there be any way? Did you think about setting universities the task of sorting out what their priorities would be and how they'd meet these strategies?
Unfortunately,
there was one more question.
Well, my question really connects to that. So it's also Fargate, so sorry to bombard you. But I've been thinking about how to frame this, and there are people in this room who have heard me say this before. My favourite pedagogical maxim is assess the students for doing what you want them to do. And it's amazing how often as teachers we fail to do that. We design clever assessments and then we wonder why they spend their time and their energies figuring out how to pass our assessments and not behaving like the students we want them to behave like. So my question is, well, there are two parts to the question. The first is, as the person who's very honestly said, I designed this framework, which I'm not familiar with, so I have no specializations. I'm not familiar with it, so I have no actual extra ground. As the person who's are you convinced, are you happy that you are assessing universities for doing what you want them to do? And connected to that, as a public servant, because you introduced public value into the thing. As a public servant, what does the public value? What does the public want universities to do? In this particular context, what does the public want postgraduate education to do?
You gave me a question that is bigger than life, but I have an answer in one word, and then I can expand if it's necessary, if it's going along. But about have I thought about other things? Yes, of course, and I do believe that incentives have to be changed. You know, they have to stay there for some while, like let's say 5 years, and they have to be changed. I'm also fairly familiar with the performance assessment exercise that UK introduced, and I've also have had the opportunity to speak about the consequences that have been faced afterwards in all different kinds of levels. How those who are involved in the peer review, how they feel about evaluating, knowing that the funding will be untouched, and how also the best universities get sort of boosted up, and then the rest of the universities are sort of staying in that level, how the the scholarship is disappearing, giving the way that mobile sort of folk that it's all there. I've been in my place for 3 years now, and that goes back a little bit to your question. I came in a situation where that model already was picked up by our Academy of Science, and for Minister Thiel, as you mentioned, I was hired as external sort of help to put that in place. I did my best to do as good job as I can, sort of working with what I had in hand so that that assessment happens. And I said that I think it has to be changed. And then when you said, how do I feel as public servant, putting all those things that make other people to be evaluated, I feel humble. That was my first sort of rule of the thumb that I said to myself, how do I get this task done? Is do no harm, do as little harm as you can. So, and therefore the strategy is smart diversification, not specialization. I don't believe in putting everything in one basket. And therefore, when we go to this operationalization of incentives, this is a one small piece of money. It's not the big. It's some 7% of money is distributed by that sort of incentive structure. We are thinking that we have to put one. And there were two reasons why we did it this way. Sort of, we knew that we will get 6.5 million. Right, so we thought with what we started with this activity involving students and creative activity, and then actually in research and creative activity came in from our conversations and push from the stakeholders. And I'm happy they did. We are first in Europe who did do this, right? So, and we thought, okay, we put that only on these limited number of criteria, and then we have an argument. For the government, we can go and ask for more money. That now we need also to evaluate internationalization. Give us another 5 million. You know, there is this strategy. You know, when you are in this position, you have to do this sort of. You have to work many directions, and do no harm and humbleness is probably the. No, I don't feel good. No.
I want to, at this moment, wrap up the discussion. For me personally, as a facilitator here in this discussion, it was really interesting. As for me as an anthropologist, I couldn't fail to notice that what we observe here is a rather different kinds of perspectives and problems that people in the ministry are facing, and what people in the academia are facing. They produce different kinds of stories, and they show that maybe. When we are talking about, for instance, things like added value, we think about different things that are being added, and because of that, we get into some kind of trouble. Because I think, from my own perspective,
Sorry, it gives us hope. We don't get in trouble. It
no.
opens a door.
Trouble is produced because we talk, we miss each other when we discuss. I think that in our conversations at universities, we constantly complain about losing the added value in our work. I think that's the problem that we face every day. That we fear. That's our fear. At the same time, while we are kind of going towards more added value. But I think that in Latvia, in contrast to what is happening in Denmark, we are still in a very, very unique position in the sense that in Latvian universities, their autonomy is still there. That we still actually are at least formally in charge, and nobody is appointing our rector, our senate, and deans, and all the university structure is made by ourselves, by universities themselves, including defining their strategies, of course, in the constraint of that.
I'm sorry.
Of course, well, let's leave this. Well, that's right. I couldn't stop myself from involving in this discussion. But thank you very much. I think this was a fascinating discussion, and thank you everybody for getting involved. Thank you.